This is another one of my videos on Untitled Parker's short history of the Second World War, this one dealing with two subjects, different responses to inflation and Italy. Both of them come from Parker's long chapter on economies at war. As is common with wartime production, then production expanded to meet demand across the warring nations. Unemployment disappeared in war economies and incentives increased wages. But whilst workers had more money, there was less to buy. There was an obvious danger of an inflationary cycle in which rising prices brought demands for higher wages, which in turn would lead to yet higher prices. If unchecked, such a cycle destroys confidence in the currency, brings social conflict, and eventually checks or stops production. Raising taxation to cover military spending may also lead to demands for higher wages. Wartime governments raised taxes as high as they dared, appealing to the relatively poor, who collectively held the main spending power, to sacrifice in a spirit of fair equality. Governments took action to hold down prices by fixing maximum prices and sometimes by paying subsidies to make those prices profitable to producers. Artificially low prices brought scarcity and therefore rationing, a familiar civilian experience during the war. Different countries adopted different policies. In Britain, high taxes were accompanied by appeals to shared sacrifice. A tax of 50% for single persons on incomes above £400 a year was lubricated, as Parker's done, by a tax of 97.5% on incomes over 20,000. Similarly, indirect taxation of 16 2/3% on many consumer goods was justified by taxing luxuries at 100%. But in Britain, in 1943, taxation only financed half of the British government's expenditure. The rest came from savings or inflationary credit creation. Saving was repeatedly and eloquently presented as a citizen's duty. It became a patriotic expression of solidarity for those who were sheltered from war itself. There were national savings weeks and the like. Germany was most effective in controlling inflation. The cost of living for the British working class rose by 25% between 1939 and 1943, but only by 10% for the Germans. Direct taxation was lower in Germany, taking a small proportion of personal income, and taxes only met about 1/3 of government spending. But Germany could impose purchase terms on conquered countries and so hold down the price of German imports from them. Germany also had an effective administration with a formidable coercive apparatus and could control prices, enforce rationing, and hold down wages. In Germany, it was possible to drain off purchasing power by thinly disguised compulsory lending to the state. The funds of banks, saving banks, and insurance companies were placed at the disposal of the governments, and individuals and corporations were compelled to keep accounts there. This policy of compulsory saving raised as much money as taxation. Walter Funk, the German economic minister, claimed that plunder from conquered territories would make it possible to repay the compulsory savings eventually. That is, Germans were forced to gamble on victory with their savings. In Britain, the economist J.M. Keynes also advocated compulsory saving, but the Treasury applied it only timidly, so that it only raised about 3.5% of the total amount of taxation. This is Walter Funk, the German Minister for Economic Affairs from 1938 to 1945. Now let's turn to the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, inflation was high, even though in theory the government directed the economy. Official figures put the wartime increase in retail prices at 325%. The state gave priority and incentives to the economically useful, and amidst catastrophic shortages, it could not protect the economically inessential by forcing an equality of sacrifice. The war accentuated the tendency for the Soviet Union to break away from the egalitarian idealism of the early revolutionaries. The government cared about winning the support of those sections of the population who could contribute most to the war effort, more than doctrinal purity. Now let's turn to talk about the Italian economy and economic management during the war. The Italian government adopted a relatively relaxed attitude towards war finance. It wrongly assumed that an increased money supply would generate a corresponding increase in savings, as long as the state controlled wages, prices, and private investment, and rationed civilian construction. Arms production required extra imports because Italy needed raw materials and fuel, but the British blockade restricted these, and Italy's German allies preferred to take surplus Italian labor to Germany rather than allot raw materials to the Italian war industry. In some areas, armament production actually fell, and of course ill-equipped Italian armies were defeated in Africa, the Balkans, and in the Soviet Union. Exports fell both because of the British blockade and concentration on producing war supplies. Import prices rose sharply. In June 1943, on the free market in Geneva in Switzerland, the Italian currency sold for 1/7 of its 1938 value. The official cost of living rose 3.5 times between 1938 and 1943, whilst black market prices rose much higher. Coal imports fell, and there were annual shortages of over 2.5 million tons of what was required. Only 1/3 of the raw materials needed for steel making, and less than 1/7 of necessary oil supplies were received. Illegal strikes broke out in March 1943, and protests against falling living standards soon morphed into demands for an end to the war and for political liberty. Mussolini and the fascists had come to power promising order at home and greatness abroad. Desperately seeking to survive, Mussolini unsuccessfully tried to persuade Hitler to seek peace, hardly daring to try and feeling physically ill with stomach cramps after a series of stressful interviews with the Führer. The alternative was to detach Italy from its Axis alliance, and after the Allied landings in Sicily showed that Hitler was unwilling or unable to defend Italian territory at that moment, Mussolini's former collaborators, the army, the church, the business classes, and the royal family, turned against him, and through the hesitant voice of the king, ordered him out. He went quietly, even perhaps with relief, but was soon rescued on the orders of his friend Hitler and restored to limited power in the German-sponsored Salo Republic in the north of Italy. Economic failure, combined with the perceived pointlessness of the war, made the enemies of the fascist state active and destroyed the will to fight. So many thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos, and thanks to you for listening. You're very welcome to support my channel if you want to. Please do like, comment and share on the videos, ring the bell button, subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll finish this chapter with a brief discussion of the Japanese economy during the war. Have a good day.